Well, with me today is Dr. Wil Hernandez. Wil is a professional counselor out of Southern California, I believe it is. Um, he is a life coach and a spiritual director. He is an adjunct professor for more seminaries than I can count. He is also the creator and manager and president of a group called the Nouwen Legacy. And today we are talking about Henri Nouwen. So I am very pleased that you made time in your schedule to talk to me today. Welcome, Wil.
Thank you, Kyle.
So our Lenten program here at the church is going to be based on the writings of Henri Nouwen, which you did your dissertation on Henri Nouwen. You've led retreats on Henri Nouwen. So what was the first thing that drew you to Nouwen's writings and ministry?
To be very honest about it, the first time I heard Nouwen was back when I was a counseling student in Manila.
Okay.
And my professor was raving about his book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, but I was unimpressed at the time until I sort of dismissed it. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready for it, but when I went to the States in 1995, I came across the news that Henri Nouwen died. And
Okay.
that's when I realized this guy is big time. I mean, he's all over the news. But the real event, or I would say the real sort of like catalyst that reconnected me with the works of Nouwen was when I was on my first year as a doctoral student. I was a teaching assistant for one of the largest ministry classes, and The Return of the Prodigal Son was required reading. So I had no choice but sort of revisit and reread it. But I have to say that as a result of my first brush with his writing, I just found myself devouring his books one after another. And that's how much his work impacted me, because here's a guy who clearly and evidently wrote not from his head, but from deep down his heart. And he did represent what I would call a very heart-centered, heart-focused, heart-oriented spirituality. In fact, he wrote an article. I think he wrote it for Harvard Divinity School Bulletin. It's entitled, "What Do You Know by Heart?"
Oh, okay.
And he's talking about the whole arena of spiritual formation, that you don't really educate anybody unless the heart is changed, you know?
Okay, yeah.
And you've read the cliche, which I don't know where it came from, but certainly it was something that Parker Palmer, a good friend of Nouwen's, embodied in a number of his writings, that the real heart of education is the education of the heart.
Sure.
Yeah. You know? And so Nouwen, everything that he did like came out of the depths of his heart, which he calls the inner sanctuary of his being. Yeah.
Do you think, because I had that same, and I forget what book it was, but I had that same kind of encounter of picking up Henri Nouwen once and thinking, don't really get all the hype, whatever, putting it down.
Right.
But then coming back to it probably about 10 years later or so, and then really finding a depth and an honesty that drew me in. Do you think that we need to, that Nouwen speaks more to the seasoned in some sense? Like you have to be in a certain place to receive Nouwen?
Probably. To a certain extent, yes, that may be true. But I would dare say Nouwen's writings are timeless.
Yeah.
And always timely wherever you're at. You just have to, I guess it helps when you know the context of why he's writing what, But honestly, Kyle, I remembered one time I was browsing through the spirituality section of Borders bookstore when it was still open in
It was still there. Yeah.
And a title of the book caught my attention. It riveted my attention. It's called The Spirituality of Imperfection, which was about kind of anthology or kind of compilation of war stories related to Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay.
Yeah, but the moment I saw that title, the first thing that came to mind, honestly, was Henri Nouwen,
Sure.
because to me, he really embodied and exemplified a spirituality of imperfection. And I
Sure.
think that's what attracted me to Nouwen,
Okay.
because he's so relatable.
Yeah.
You know, we can connect with him because of who he was and how transparent and real and authentic he was as an author. You know, he was just being himself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and maybe as a plug, that became the title to your book on Nouwen's
Yes,
spirituality.
yes, I
Yeah.
did steal that title.
Sure. Not to
For
out
it
you,
was
but
actually it was actually the title of my dissertation work, and then when Paulus Press published it, we sort of like latched on to that title, A
sure. Yeah.
Spirituality of Imperfection,
Yeah.
which of course is intriguing,
Yeah.
because most people would not equate spirituality with brokenness or woundedness, you know.
No. Yeah.
But Henry Nouwen again is sort of like a conundrum in the sense that he was very flawed, he was scarred, he was very much a broken person, but he exhibited and lived out a depth of spirituality that no one can deny.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's maybe dig into that. So, because so often we talk about, or maybe in the modern context, we talk about, the victory of our faith and we are more than conquerors and all
Right,
that kind of
right.
stuff. But what is, Nouwen did so well to talk about struggle and imperfection and all that stuff. What is the role of struggle or imperfection or laboring, or what's the role of that in our spiritual lives?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. The truth is, if I may admit, I came from that orientation or tradition.
Did you?
You know,
Okay.
I was brought up in that kind of a very triumphalistic
Yeah.
type of Christianity, where we are supposed to be victorious every moment of our lives. And if we're not, there's something wrong with us. We are
Sure.
guilt stricken, right? One of the reasons why I wrote Spirituality of Imperfection was for my own benefit, for my own healing. I felt like that freed me up and released me from the burden of having to live out an impossible, quote unquote, life,
Sure.
which is really, in reality, almost non existent, if we're honest enough to admit it.
Yeah.
And that's what, again, makes Nouwen's works attractive, because you can connect with what he's saying, that we're all works in
Yeah.
progress, that we're all under construction, that there is the reality of progress. He is a very hopeful person. He's not a defeatist type person,
No.
but at the same time he's very realistic about the fact that all throughout our lives we will struggle our way through, and in the depth of our struggle is when we experience the profound transformation that our hearts are longing for. And many of us get into that illusion that life is supposed to be tidy, orderly, and neat existence, which again is farthest from the truth, as waking experience proves it, right?
Sure.
And the thing about it is, like, we are, I guess, too exposed to ministers, priests, leaders who are too good to be true. But they are, but they're unreachable. They're
Sure.
inaccessible. It's like when we find ourselves, for example, struggling, I bet we won't go to them for fear that they wouldn't understand. They
Sure.
couldn't identify, and we probably would not welcome being convicted through the verses that they will share and stuff like that, But probably we would go to a person whom we know intuitively has been there and done that,
Sure.
Because they don't speak theoretically. They don't speak from textbooks either. They speak from experience. And that's what sets Henri Nouwen apart.
Absolutely.
His whole theology, his whole uh, trajectory of his ministry is very phenomenological, very experience based, because he was heavily influenced by Anton Boysen, one
Okay.
of his
Yep.
heroes in the faith, who's the founder and the father of CPE, Clinical Pastoral
Okay.
Education.
Yeah.
He was the one who coined the famous phrase, the theology of the living human document.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, you
Mhm.
don't theologize and minister from a textbook. You theologize out of your own lived experience, which makes it very potent,
Yeah.
very powerful. And that's how now in minister, he's not a clinician, he's not a
No.
technician, he's not a dogmatician. He's
Yeah.
very much, living out his spirituality from experience that everybody can easily
Sure.
relate to.
Yeah. Yeah. So where does, one of the things that I appreciate of Nouwen in writing is his brutal honesty about his own flaws. And,
Mhm.
he talks about his just kind of almost visceral yearning for love and for acceptance, and he talks about his own kind of breakdowns and all of that kind of things. But even when he's talking about his darkest of moments, there's always this sense of hope. Like he's a
Yes.
very hopeful person. So where does this hope come from for Nouwen?
I really believe and I'm convinced that his love for Jesus is so passionate.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of people love him, because he's very gospel centered, he's very Christ centered.
Yeah.
And I think that his hope is solidly anchored on Jesus, whom he loves so deeply, and nothing can ever usurp that rightful role in his life.
Sure.
So he remains very focused
Yeah.
despite all the struggles that he goes through. I think his
Yeah.
faithfulness to his God, to Jesus, is so remarkable, and nobody can doubt that. Even his
Absolutely.
closest friends will attest to that.
Yeah.
So his hope is not on something very external, but something that is very real for him, based on the profundity of his own relationship with Jesus.
Absolutely.
Mm.
One, I've just finished reading Letters to Mark about Jesus, and
Yeah.
I find exactly that, the way he writes about who Jesus is and who Jesus is for him and who Jesus can be for Mark, is
Right.
just, it's endearing. You get
And
it.
very unapologetic.
Yes, absolutely.
When he was at Harvard, he was condescendingly looked down upon by others because he unashamedly proclaimed Jesus in the corridors of Harvard. Nobody
Sure.
does that.
Yeah.
At Harvard, they talk about God in abstraction,
Sure.
but he was Nouwen, who one biographer or interpreter remarked, he's like one of those revivalist evangelists coming
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
of a revival tent, in his passion and his unashamed proclamation of
Yeah.
the gospel. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other things I like about Nouwen is when you kind of read through some of his I guess his corpus. He wrote 40 books, more is being put out, but that you get the sense of his restless journey, right?
Yes.
And I wonder if sometimes we think that our Christian life, we need to have it figured out fully, who I am, what my ministry is, but Nouwen didn't. Like, so he went to Latin America and found, well, that's not where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
He kind of tried different things before he found where he was to be.
Mhm.
And so you get the sense of restlessness, and he articulates that quite well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, in a lot of different ways. In fact, his restlessness, and I wrote about it, has an inward, has an outward, and a Godward dimension to it. And inwardly, his restlessness has to do with what he calls his first search and research, which is going deep down into his own heart. It's a
Sure.
journey it's an interior journey toward the heart,
Yeah.
which of course was exemplified by the Desert Fathers and Mothers,
Sure.
who knew how to exegete their own heart. They were very familiar with the alphabet of their own heart, which of course now and again embodied.
Yeah.
So he was restless because he's always kind of like um, wrestling with the beatings of his own heart, the irregular beatings of his own
Yeah.
heart,
Yeah.
I would say. but he's also restless in terms of taking a significant assuming a significant role in what God is doing in the world.
Okay.
He always wants to sort of like not just play a role or play a part, but fill in a role in
Sure.
terms of making a dent, a significant impact in the world. That's why it spoke so much of his, social justice concerns
Yeah.
and peace concerns and all that.
Yeah.
But most importantly, Kyle, I think his restlessness has to do with his genuine search for God.
Yeah.
His was a real heart seeking after God, very Augustinian in many ways, the oft quoted
Yeah. Our
phrase of
heart is
Augustine,
restless. Yeah.
our hearts are restless until they find a rest in God. He really firmly believed
Sure.
that we are built for communion. And unless we find that in our ongoing abiding relationship with God, we will forever feel the restlessness of our souls.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So out of that restlessness, he ends up finding himself at L'Arche. And you can't really talk about Nouwen without talking about L'Arche.
Yes.
What did L'Arche bring to him?
I think he calls that, again, the phrase has been sort of very much associated with now, and it's called the fellowship of the weak.
Okay.
Yeah. In L'Arche, he found solidarity with people who are imperfect, who are flawed. In fact, it was said that it took L'Arche for Nouwen to actually grapple head on with his own handicap.
Sure.
Being kind of like face to face with people who have disabilities and all that. And so it's kind of like his own disability, if you will, or spiritual handicap of all sorts were dragged into sharper focus. But L'Arche was a gift because at L'Arche, he was not the popular, well sought out Nouwen because they didn't even know that.
Sure.
He'd written books that they weren't even familiar with, but they never cared because all they cared about was Nouwen's presence, there, his sort of like priestly and pastoral presence amongst them. And so that was enough for them. So in many ways, Nouwen found the community, at least an approximation of the community his heart was longing for. Sure. Ironically, it was also the community that brought him a lot of grief and a lot of pain and a lot of hurt, which is what Nouwen is about. It's always like that contradiction of situations and events and realities, that he managed to sort of navigate all throughout his life anyway.
So when you go through Nouwen's books and articles, are there main themes that often pop up in the way that he writes? One of the themes I think is community. He's always trying to kind of long for that. Are there other main themes that you just see kind of pop up again and again and again?
Yeah, it's as Nouwen readers would always say, Nouwen repeats himself like a million times. You read his books and the same concepts reappear.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it has a way of piercing through your heart, and that's I did say this in my other interview that his works really they do have a mark of a classic, a modern classic, in that it's so profound you'd have to plumb through the depths of layers upon layers of his writings. Now I'm losing my train of thought. You were asking me about
themes.
Themes. For example, yes, solitude, presence, community. The one other thing that's remarkable about Nouwen is he was way ahead of his time. It's almost like as a child of modernity, he had this uncanny way of a precognition, if you will, of the advent of postmodernity. And again, in constructive postmodernity, the discourse on community is uppermost. But even before postmodernity kind of like got sort of like kicked off, if you will, for want of a better word, Nouwen has already written about community in profound ways
Yeah.
before community became a buzzword of the day. So he was
Sure.
kind of way ahead, you
Absolutely.
know.
Absolutely.
But more than concepts of community, if I would like distill Nouwen's theme in just one focal point,
Mhm.
I believe that he wrote about the spiritual life in
Sure.
a very focused way.
Yeah.
Everything he wrote about sort of redound. I mean, it goes all the way back to his commitment to talk about our life with God.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and again, I hesitate to say this, but that's why I wrote about mere spirituality
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
because that's what Nouwen is all about. He never strayed from that focus.
Yeah.
He did, he did talk about all these different arenas and field of studies and all that, but only as they relate to our life with God.
Yeah.
So that's what, again, that's what stands out about
Sure.
Nouwen for
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
Well, and Mere Spirituality, for those who don't know, is another book that Will wrote on the spirituality of Henri Nouwen. The other thing is, I think he labored to make the spiritual life plain and simple.
Yes.
Like um, he talks in some works about laboring over his journals to try to make it as plain as possible to be
True.
able to be received by as many people as possible. So he really wanted it to be approachable, and
Yes.
and the life with God to be seen as approachable and as livable.
Yes. And people have heard me say like a million times that as much as Merton, the intellectual, spiritual giant that he was to
We love,
Nouwen,
yeah.
I mean, he was one of Nouwen's heroes in the faith. And I love Merton's writings myself.
Yeah.
But I always dare say, which is really my personal bias, is that Nouwen succeeded in putting the jar of spirituality on the lower shelf
Sure.
and made spirituality highly accessible,
Yeah,
reachable, relatable.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and you see this really uniquely, I think, in um, the way of the beloved. No, what is
Life of the Beloved.
Yeah, the life of the beloved, where he writes this trying to be as plain as he can. And at the end of the book, he says he failed because because it did seem too Christian. Like it was supposed to be a book about the spiritual life for those who had no understanding of the spiritual life. And yet it's been so well adopted by the Christian community, by people who are saying this is exactly what we're wanting. This
right,
is this sense of that we are beloved of God, and this is what the life with God is about. Speaks very deeply to us.
True. And I don't think that Nouwen anticipated any of that.
No.
When he wrote it.
Yeah.
But that just tells you volumes of what people's hearts are genuinely longing for.
Sure.
Their own identity.
Yeah.
I mean, clarifying their own identity. I always said this, and I think it's very true that little book, Life of the Beloved, has actually become a modern classic.
Sure. Yeah.
It's a bestseller. And one of the things that Henri Nouwen always spoke about was really about our belovedness that really struck, a chord in people's and many people's hearts. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, because that belovedness can be found even in the depths, even when I'm at my lowest. Yes. I am still the beloved of God, right? Which is, it's so affirmative for it. It's such a wonderful affirmation for our spiritual lives. Okay. So for those, I know that you're busy and we want to kind of wrap up, but for those who might not be so familiar with Nouwen or Nouwen's writings, where would you say that they start? Because there's so much stuff out there, and it runs the gamut of his life, and some of it are more dense, and some of it are more accessible. So where would you begin?
Hands down, I would recommend reaching out. The three movements of the spiritual life. because that's Nouwen's seminal work that articulates very clearly his schema of our life with God in three movements,
Okay.
which has the inward, outward, again, upward or Godward dimension. Now, Kyle, um, at the risk again of sounding like self-promoting,
Sure. Hey.
one of the reasons why I wrote Mere Spirituality is precisely for the people you're mentioning.
Okay. Yeah.
They're inundated by Nouwen's works, quoted left and right by
Sure.
people, and they're overwhelmed. Where do I start? You know, and all that. I wrote that book because I sort of like distilled everything, literally everything that Nouwen spoke about on the spirit, that he talked about on the spiritual life in one book. It's the one book that I never used any external sources. It's all primary sources. It's the
sure.
voice of
Yeah,
Nouwen.
Yeah.
It's like the only thing I did was to put it together, synthesize, integrate, and distill his work. So it's got the timeline of Nouwen. It's got the major themes that Nouwen addressed when it comes to the spiritual life. So
Sure.
I know it doesn't sound so good that I'm promoting it, but that's the purpose why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Well, I'll promote it because I have that book and I've read it and I love it. And so for anybody at the church who wants, I'm happy to lend that out. That's still in publication though, so people can still kind of get that through Amazon or through the local bookstore.
Right. Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Wil, thank you very much for taking some time and talk to me about Nouwen. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I know that you're busy. Thank you very, very much.
And thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about my patron saint.
Wonderful. Yeah. Just before we end, you have a new book coming out. Do you want us just let people know about that is?
I actually just came out of a book, a book called Accidental Monk.
Mm-hmm.
It's my first book that's non-Nouwen, although Nouwen reappears here and there. But it's about how I got stranded for 2.5 months in a Benedictine abbey in the Philippines.
Sure.
During the height of the pandemic, the lockdown.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a chronicle of struggle, faith, and surrender. So, and I'm working on a book right now, which has been, I've been working on it for the last several years. It's called Quest for the Center, exploring our spiritual core.
Wonderful.
Again, the center is very much in the concept of the center is very much influenced, as you know, by Henri Nouwen.
Sure. Yeah. The hub and spoke.
The wagon wheel symbol, the hub being the center to which all the spokes are attached and all that. So I guess, that's part and parcel of my calling, and whatever I do, Nouwen's profoundly influenced me, and I've committed myself to really propagate his spiritual legacy.
Wonderful. Again, blessings on your ministry, and thank you for our conversation.
Thank you.
All right.